Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us here at this press conference with the Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory and in Israel. We're pleased to have with us today all three members of the Commission who wanted to take this opportunity to speak to you about the findings of their latest report. The chair of the Commission, Ms. Navi Pillay, will be joining us online via Zoom. And with us here in Geneva, our fellow experts, Mr. Miloon Kothari and Mr. Chris Sidoti. As you may know, the Commission of Inquiry was established by the Human Rights Council in 2021, and this morning here at the Palais des Nations, they presented their second report to the Council. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Chris Sidoti for opening remarks, and then over to you for your questions.
Thanks, Todd. I'd like to start on behalf of the Commission of Inquiry simply to give a very short overview of what we covered in the report. It's just to give you some background so that you know a little more about what we've done and what we've found and can therefore orient any questions you wish to make. As you know, we've just literally walked out of the Council chamber. We've just presented our second report. We're required to report both to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly on an annual basis. And so this is our second report to the Council, but our third report in total. This report looked closely at restrictions on civic space, dealing both with the role of civil society organisations and the difficulties that they have faced. For the first time, we exercised the breadth of our mandate. We are unique amongst UN mechanisms that have come out of the Human Rights Council to look at the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Unique principally because we have responsibility to look inside Israel as well. And so our report examined the attacks, restrictions and harassment of civil society actors in all parts of the territories. That is Israel, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And we also looked at all duty bearers, that is the government of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and to the extent to which it is relevant, the de facto authority in Gaza, Hamas. Our report reflects the findings that we made on the basis of our examination of evidence over a lengthy period. We found that the majority of violations are being committed by the Israeli authorities as part of the Israeli government's goal of ensuring and enshrining its permanent occupation at the expense of the Palestinian people. Let me look at Israel first then. We found that the Israeli government has increasingly restricted civic space through a strategy of delegitimizing and silencing civil society. This includes criminalizing Palestinian civil society organizations and their members, by labelling 6 of them as terrorist organisations and a 7th as an unlawful organisation. Civil society organisations are pressured and threatened. When they give a platform for civil society discourse, they are under attack simply because they are critical to the policies and practices of the Israeli occupying authorities. The Israeli actions against them are directed very much, as I have said, at delegitimizing them, but going beyond that, trying to cut off their sources of funding and support. So the attacks on Palestinian civil society include actively lobbying donors and implementing measures or threatening new measures, as is currently the case, to cut sources of funding and international support. We found that this strategy is principally directed towards Palestinian organisations, but we also found that it is directed in a lesser way at this stage against Israeli human rights organisations. The simple conclusion that we came to was that any criticism of the policies and practices of the State of Israel and any support for the rights of Palestinian people can attract retributive action on the part of the Israeli authorities and attempts to shut down civic space. Looking in particular at the organisations labelled as terrorist, 6 of them, and the one labelled as unlawful, we came to the conclusions that these labellings were unjustified and that they violated fundamental human rights, including the rights to freedom of association, expression, opinion, peaceful assembly and privacy, and the right to a fair trial. We were particularly concerned at the targeting of Israeli civil society organisations and journalists within Israel itself, representing a tightening of restrictions there for those who would support Palestinian human rights issues. We also found that Palestinian authorities, both in the occupied West Bank and in Gaza, were also targeting Palestinian human rights defenders and civil society activists with the aim of silencing dissenting opinions. This has led to the arrest and detention of Palestinian activists, including by the Israeli authorities, not just by the Palestinian authorities on the West Bank. And we saw this as a particularly harsh reality, the revolving door of detention for many Palestinian activists. We looked in particular at the killing of one Palestinian activist, Nizar Banat, at the hands of the Palestinian authorities. We looked as well at cases both in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory, where activists were detained and subjected to ill treatment, at times reaching the level of torture. We looked at the targeting of particular groups, including journalists, women human rights defenders, artists and cultural activists, and as well at the targeting of Palestinian cultural centres that were promoting diversity and the inclusion of LGBTQ persons. Our report to the Council is necessarily short. We have to face word restrictions, as you know. But on this occasion, we have produced a detailed conference room paper that expands upon the findings of our report and the discussion of the various cases. So far as we're aware, this is the first time that a United Nations human rights investigative body has dedicated a thorough investigation to the situation of Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders inside Israel itself. The violation of rights inside Israel falls squarely within our geographical mandate, and we will continue dedicating attention to that in our coming reports. The discussion at the Human Rights Council today was quite full. We had 50 member states, plus Palestine as an observer state, so 51 states speaking during the course of the interactive dialogue. We were greatly encouraged that not one of the 51 states that spoke took any issue with the content of our report, with our findings and recommendations. There were critical comments made on many situations, and there were many comments made about the situation on the ground in Palestine. But there were no issues raised about anything in our report itself. So that was encouraging for us and encouraging for us in our future work as well. We'll continue that work. Our mandate, as you may know, is not time limited, and it's not limited to a specific incident or event, but is a broad mandate. And with the encouragement of the Human Rights Council, we continue that work as an independent commission. We'll continue making recommendations, particularly on accountability measures, with the view to avoiding impunity and ensuring that those responsible for violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law are held to account. All those responsible, both those bearing direct immediate responsibility and those in positions of command responsibility. We continue to urge that all those engaged in the situation in Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territories and elsewhere, turn away from violence, end the killings, support peaceful resolution of this conflict. And we particularly appeal to UN member states to exercise their responsibilities as third states to ensure peace, justice, and human rights throughout the areas within our jurisdiction. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. So, Todd, back to you.
Thank you, Chris, for those remarks. We'll open the floor now to questions. Do we have any from the room? If you could just please identify yourself and the media outlet that you work for. Thanks.
Yes, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm Yuri Aprolev for RIA Novosti, Russian press agency. For a long time now, the UN has been warning about the colonization in Palestine and the crimes committed by Israel for a long time, yet no sanctions have ever been taken against this country. In 2014, when Crimea was reunited with Russia, Western countries immediately took sanctions, indicating that this violated international law. How do you explain that since now no one of Western countries took sanctions against Israel? Why this difference in treatment? Why the same countries are saying that someone is violating the international law and taking sanctions and not in this case? Do you think that sanctions can help to solve this situation, to make pressure on Israel about this matter?
So far as the United Nations is concerned, there is no difference in treatment. You know the problem with the Security Council. You know that any time that sanctions are suggested there, the United States or Russia or China will veto it. And so the situation in relation to Ukraine is exactly the same as Myanmar or Congo or Yemen, so far as the Security Council is concerned. Individual states make their own decisions for political reasons, and I don't have enough knowledge of 193 member states of the United Nations to know why, but I can certainly say that the problem in the Security Council that is preventing any effective sanctions on any gross violators is the problem of the vetoes of the United States, China, and Russia.
Beyond that, I can also say that when we are having our discussions with member states, particularly Western states, we are continuously making the point that the states need to go beyond just issuing statements, even condemnations, that there has to be some action. And you know, we don't think it's our place to explain what those actions are, but it's very clear that unless states go, especially states that have very strong trade ties, military ties with Israel, if they don't go beyond statements, the situation is not going to change. And in that context, we do keep bringing up this point about the double standards with how Ukraine is dealt with and how Palestine is dealt with. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We can go to take a question online from Agnes Pedrero from Agence France Presse.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, Agnes Pedrero, as you say, from AFP. I have a question on your mandate. As you have heard this morning, there was some critics by countries on the mandate, the fact that it's an open-ended mandate, and there was on what it has to do. So I would like to know what is your position about those critics, and the fact that those who are supporting your mandate are that have taken the floor this morning. This group of countries are countries that are pretty much criticized by the UN, the High Commissioner, on the violations of human rights in their country. So I would like to have your opinion on those two issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We were given this mandate that it's open-ended, unlike any of the previous commissions of inquiry. And we think that we actually agree, the commissioners agree that this is justified. One of the countries today mentioned, why isn't there a sunset clause? And you know, our response would be that there seems to be no sunset clause. You know, recommended to Israel to end the occupation. So as long as the occupation continues, the United Nations needs to continue to rigorously investigate the situation, and therefore we would like to see a sunset of the Israeli occupation. And once that happens, I think we would perhaps support there being a discussion in the Council as to what to do with our Commission of Inquiry. But until that time, an open-ended mandate is more than justified. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions from the room? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, John Zarakos, I'm with the Lancet in France 24. I'd like the commissioners to elaborate a little bit on what you outline in paragraph 10 of your report on testimonies from civil society organizations in Europe and the US about the shrinking space for freedom of expression in relation to criticizing Israel. Can you shed some more light on what's going on in Europe and the US on this issue? Thanks.
We heard from a number of people in Europe and in the United States who are active in human rights organizations and are finding that increasingly they are criticized and criticized vitriolically whenever they seek to report objectively and advocate on the basis of law in relation to the policies and practices of the Israeli government. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. There are quite strong campaigns at times against individuals or against organizations who have been critical. And I would instance a very prominent person, we've not spoken to him about this, but just the experience that Ken Roth had in relation to an appointment at Harvard University is an example. He was head of Human Rights Watch, one of the most respected human rights non-government organizations on the planet. And the way in which he was treated was scandalous. So those kinds of attacks on activists, on people who are vocal, attempts not just to be vitriolic about them and personally offensive, but to short-circuit their career. These are becoming more frequent, and we are hearing more about it. We mentioned in the report about attempts to defund or to restrict the funding of some of the Palestinian and Israeli organizations. And we have heard about similar attempts to cut the fundraising sources for organizations in Europe and the United States as well. I mean, it seems that the freedom of speech and freedom of advocacy is what's under attack here. It's not just an attack on the organizations, but on what they say and their ability to say it. So it's very much an issue, and it's because it's an issue, one that we heard a great deal about, that we included it in our report.
I think, John, that the issue extends to inside Israel, and that's part of our mandate. And we have heard from human rights NGOs, Israeli human rights NGOs. We have heard from Israeli filmmakers about the filmmakers who are trying to portray accurately the situation in the occupied territories, both historically and as it's evolving currently. That they're under stress. They're funding. There's more monitoring of their activity, including individual Israeli Jewish lawyers who are defending Palestinians. There's even calls for funds that had been given previously by the government to support cultural activities, government asking for those funds back. So this whole phenomenon of restricting any opposition voices towards the major occupation goals of the Israeli government, whether they're Palestinians, Israelis inside Israel, whether they're international groups, is a very concerted effort right now, and it's a very calibrated and coordinated effort. It's not a coincidence that so many groups abroad are, supporting whatever Israel does, but also so many groups that are opposing are facing difficulties. And this is also leading to a sort of a chilling effect where groups are unwilling to speak out as they were before, because they don't want to be, come under this kind of surveillance and whatever other threats there may be from the side of the Israeli government. Thank you.
Our chair, Navi, is at a disadvantage because she's sitting there on the screen and can't immediately interject. Are there things, Navi, that you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Actually, it's been worse because I raised my hand here on the computer, but the host wouldn't let me unmute. So I was quite trapped. So I'm sorry, may I return to Anis's question that she heard this morning before the Human Rights Council, the objection to the commission because it doesn't have an end date, it's not time bound, and it has an expansive mandate. You notice that the US made the statement on behalf of 27 states. And that is the reason why those states and some in Europe voted against the resolution establishing this commission. But it was adopted by a majority. And once that happens at the UN, every member state is obliged to support that mandate because it is a UN resolution. That's one. But the other reason that really intrigues me is, isn't it a spurious, very silly reason not to talk to the commissioners because they have an open mandate? And that's a reason they're giving. And Chris has already pointed out, not one of them commented on the substance of our allegations. Just the objection is that we are open-ended. So, and I didn't respond to it today because we've responded to that query 3 times already in the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly twice. So this would be the 3rd time. We didn't respond to it because we addressed all that. It's an old issue about one of the commissioners being anti-Semitic. We've addressed all this. We've addressed and pointed out to those states that they themselves approved other commissions that had no end date, such as the Triple-I mechanism on Syria. And I think, Chris, you knew the other one. At the time we mentioned, yeah, you've already, yes, accepted you funding these bodies. So that's why we come to this point that Miloon is making about double standards. So I just wanted to clear that on why we didn't think we're going to be addressing that issue again and again and again. It is a mandate by resolution now, and every member has to respect that. So sorry, back to the questions that interest the media. So I'll bring my hand down. No, it's someone else's hand up there.
Okay, thank you, Navi. We can go next to Emma Farge, who is online from Reuters.
Thanks very much, commissioners. I wanted to know more about this lobbying that you discovered to pressure donors to end funding. What sort of evidence did you come across? Was it kind of letters, or how was it being carried out? And what sort of leverage would those groups have over donors, and was it effective? And finally, were these just targeting Palestinian organizations, or were they also going for kind of neutral international NGOs or even the UN itself? Thank you.
Maybe I made the comment, so maybe I go first in answering. The strongest, or the cases that we looked at most closely, were the 7 Palestinian non-government organisations that were labelled 6 as terrorists and 1 as unlawful. In those cases, the evidence was from the donors themselves. These organisations were receiving European aid, and the European agencies themselves, governments and agencies, indicated that they had received representations that these were terrorist organisations. they conducted their own investigations, and as a result of their own investigations, they decided to continue funding. But the organisations themselves acknowledged the approaches made to them by the Israeli government. They indicated that they had received information from the Israeli government, and in all cases, with one possible exception in relation to one organisation, there was complete satisfaction that the declarations of unlawfulness or terrorist activity were totally unjustified. So this has been very well documented publicly, and in addition, we have seen a good deal of private information. The targeting of Western donors is different from that. It's related much more to campaigns and allegations that the complaints or the criticism of Israeli practice and policy is based upon some racial, racist or ideological grounds rather than on human rights law. And this is really an attempt to smear the organisations and to reduce their donors as a result of that. And we've seen that I won't name the organisations, but we've seen it in the case of a number of well-known international non-government organisations that are active in relation to human rights that have found that the smear campaigns have been directed towards their donors.
I should also add that we had a mission to a Western European country where we actually took the testimony of a national human rights organization that supports the work in Palestine, and they told us that there were legal cases filed against them to make sure that they cannot continue to function. So there are more and more cases coming from pro-Israel groups. We don't know if the government of Israel is behind that or not, but that doesn't matter. The question is that there is increasing pressure, whether it's legal or it's, as Commissioner Sidoti mentioned, smear campaigns against anyone, anywhere in the world who is attempting to defend the rights of Palestinians and clearly point out the violations coming from the Israeli side. This is a concerted global campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Miloon. So we'll go to Nick Cumming-Bruce from the New York Times.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. A couple of questions, really. I think there was reference in the debate today about how people had come forward. You were thanking people who were giving testimony, sometimes at the risk of their lives. I'm just wondering if you could go a little bit into the kind of reprisals or threats or intimidation that you're aware of that has been directed at people giving evidence to your inquiry, whether from the Palestinian side or from the Israeli side. And secondly, I was a little surprised that in a report that pays so much attention to journalists, there was no reference to Shireen Abu Akleh. And you had a hearing in relation to that particular case. I kind of wonder where your inquiries on that have gone and whether you've seen any movement towards accountability for that. Thank you.
Last question first, Nick. There is a reference to Shireen Abu Akleh, but only a reference in passing. We're continuing our investigations into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, and as our chair indicated in the opening statement to the council today, that will be included as a major case study in our report to the General Assembly in October. If the investigations had not been concluded in spite of the evidence that we'd taken so far, in time for us to include it in the current report to the Human Rights Council. So it's continuing and it will appear then, and we indicated in our report that that was the case, and the chair referred to it again in her opening statement to the council. Do you want to take the first one?
Well, we can add here that we heard evidence relating to her killing at the oral hearings, including from members of the family. I just added a bit. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Nick, are you done, Navi? Would you like to
continue? Yes, thank you. Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Nick, for your first question. We have been having a series of public hearings. We've had two in Geneva. And in addition to the public hearings, we've also had closed hearings. The closed hearings took place with activists from the occupied territories and with some journalists who are continuously under threat, and that's why they're closed hearings. We take extensive measures to ensure that people who come to speak before us are safe, but a number of them have told us that there is no guarantee. Of course, they know the risk they're taking, and there's no guarantee that they will either be allowed to go back to the occupied territories or if there will not be other types of reprisals. So we are investigating a number of cases. We cannot reveal that at this moment, but there is overwhelming evidence that people who do testify and who do speak out against Israel are under threat. Often it's intimidation, often it's impacts on their family, often it's death threats. There are smear campaigns. We've heard a lot of different cases, but we will be revealing them as the time goes on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the room or for those of you joining us online? Okay, Navi or any of the members of the commission, do you have anything else to add?
No, I don't, but we actually very much rely on the media as well, because you always hear of an incident after the event. So we follow media very closely as well as you get information on the harassment of civil societies. So I've heard this too, but I can't recall specific cases just now about even where I'm referring to the European Union first stopping the funding to NGOs and journalists and on this terrorism charge. Then they did their own inquiry and stopped that. In the Netherlands was also a case where they stopped funding coming to an NGO. So that's what I mean. These are just sprinkling of evidence. We have to examine and look into that before we report on it.
But if I can add, as our chair is saying, the media is very important for us to get the message out, obviously from our reports, but even more than that, to accurately report on what is happening on the ground. Whenever there are incidents, there is some sort of conflict, whether it's real conflict or perpetrated conflict. We have copious video evidence. We have a lot of other evidence, and I think it's very important that the media reports accurately. And also, I just want to mention that we would really appreciate the media publicizing more what we think is a major advance that came from the presentation of our report to the General Assembly in October last year, which was seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. This process is underway, and we are encouraging as many countries as possible to submit their position papers. But it's very important for the media to follow this, because this can have major implications in terms of clarifying what exactly is this thing called permanent occupation, in terms of clarifying what are responsibilities of third state parties to ensuring that the Israeli occupation comes to an end. Thank you very much.
And my last comment is just to watch this space. Our report to the General Assembly in October will deal with the issue of the use of force throughout the area. Clearly, it will ask questions about the use of excessive or disproportionate force. As I mentioned in response to Nick, the Shireen Abu Akleh case will be dealt with in that context, but it's a much wider report on the use of force. So watch this space. We would anticipate that will be released by the GA early October, Giuseppe. And we'll be there probably around the 3rd week of October. And that will be our next contribution to the, this goes to us being a continuing commission. We're able to build up a body of evidence through our reports to establish, like constructing a settlement, a building that can actually give insight into what is happening. So we see our reports as running off each other and building up a picture of the whole situation, and that'll be the next one.
Yeah, if I can just mention that one of the areas we're looking at is the issue of the activities of settlers in the West Bank, but not only. We are very disturbed that violent settler activity has considerably increased in the last months, and it's leading to it's becoming in fact a means through which annexation is ensured beyond occupation, and this is an issue we will also be looking at. Who are the settlers? What are they doing? What is the damage they're causing? What is this body called settlers? I don't want to go into that right now, but as Chris said, that watch this space. We will be looking at that in much more detail. Thank you.
If you don't mind, we'll take one last question online from Tova. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, hopefully. It's just a clarification question to your last point. Are you planning to issue a separate report on settler violence, or is that just going to be part of the report you're going to deliver in New York in the fall about excessive use of force?
Well, right now, we are still discussing that. It will be part of our report to the General Assembly, but at some stage we may do standalone report on the issue of settlers and their status. Who are they? Are they, what kind of a body is it? So at some stage we might do a standalone report, but it is a major concern for us right now. Thank you.
And
you're still muted.
Sorry. Did you mean a separate report on settlements or a separate report on the phenomenon of settler violence?
Yeah, it would be a combined report, settlements and we haven't decided yet, but and settlers. But our main concern right now is the nature of settlers. There seems to be no comparable global situation where you have a group of people who are, running around doing what they're doing with full license from the state and the security forces. So I don't want to go into it more, but it's definitely an area we'll be looking at.
I should say too, Tova, the next report is in the northern fall. For Navi and me, it will be in the spring.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for those of you joining us in Geneva. Thank you, Navi, for joining us online, and thank you to the media for joining us virtually. Okay. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, media.
Thanks very much.